Hi, I'm Lee Petty, artist, art director, and project lead, currently working at Double Fine Productions in San Francisco, California. Today I'm going to talk to you about how to invite happy accidents into your conceptual art process. Happy accidents is a term that we refer to when things that are out of our control as artists show up in our images and somehow take it in an exciting new direction or make it better in some way. And concept art is hard because not only is it concerned with solving problems and finding new ideas, it's also trying to look appealing and communicate those ideas to others. But I think when you're searching for something new, it's important to stay loose and to use processes that introduce a little chaos, some elements that are not entirely under your control, so that maybe we get some happy accidents in our work. And instead of just erasing those and undoing them, it can be helpful sometimes to build on those happy accidents and see if they take you in new directions that you otherwise might not have gone. So today we're going to look into some of the processes I use that invite a little bit of those happy accidents into the work. We're going to start things off by looking at some 2D art, and I'm going to go through some processes that I used that invited some happy accidents as part of my concept design process. So what we're looking at here is a ship design I did for the video game Broken Age, which was a 2D adventure game that featured a split world. And in the boy's world, he was on board a ship that kind of looked like a monster. Now, at this early stage of the project, I didn't know how much it was supposed to look like a ship and how much it was supposed to look like a monster. So I wanted to just kind of explore things and see where it took me. And so I didn't just want to draw a monster or design a ship like I normally would. I wanted to kind of remove some control and come up with something that was a strange hybrid of the two. Now this is kind of where I wound up, but if we turn off these layers, we'll start at the very beginning. You'll see what I started with was this really abstract piece of art that I created using a tool called Alchemy that we'll go into a little bit later. Now, Alchemy is a free tool, so you'll be able to try it out yourself if you like, but you could do this in Photoshop by just using some spatter brushes or other methods just to kind of generate some random shapes. Now those shapes weren't totally random. I was trying to still design something that might look like a big jellyfish or a monster and have some technological bits in it, like these little domes and whatnot. But when I brought it in here, my goal now was to kind of keep those kind of almost accidents, these kind of strange shapes, but kind of refine it a bit. So I started adding some elements to give it a little bit more of a design and screening things back, not erasing anything really, but just kind of pushing some things back so other shapes became more dominant. Now you can see at this stage, I actually just drew over to create a more unified silhouette, but I didn't get rid of all this other stuff. I just emphasized certain aspects so that the overall design would read. And then I developed it a little further, and this is where we wound up. Now, what's interesting when you're using a tool like Alchemy, I showed you that particular starting point, but you wind up getting a PDF with a lot of this sort of abstract art that you create. And it's not completely random because you're choosing the shapes that you're working with and still trying to create silhouettes that might work, but it's a very different process and you don't have total control over it. And it's not until you take it all in Photoshop and create a complete design that you see how those happy accidents and that lack of control can actually give you a more interesting result. We're going to start off our character design process here using Alchemy, which is a free tool that focuses on creating these sort of abstract shapes. There's no erasing or undo, and when you clear the canvas, it saves it into a page on a PDF that you can look at later. So I'm just trying to explore ideas for our character. And in my head, I'm thinking about a priest-like shape. So I'm looking for some shrouded robe type shapes. And you see, I'm getting a lot of crazy stuff. And some of this stuff isn't useful, but it does kind of help free your mind up and not worry about detail and just think on overall shapes and maybe some ideas. And you can kind of guide it. You can see here that I can make something kind of figural with it and somewhat robe-like. But I try not to use it just like a drawing tool too much, because if it looks just like a drawing, then there's no point in using it. What I'm doing now is reviewing the PDF that I generated, and you can see the individual images that came out of that process. And I'm looking for maybe 3 or 4 that I can take into Photoshop and use as a starting point for our drawing. And what I've done is gone into Photoshop now, and you see on the left I have some previous priest designs that I've done that I'm using as a reference point. I want to kind of create something that looks like it could belong in that same world. And on each of these layers I have a different alchemy drawing. I'm kind of comparing some of the shape language there, looking for some of these sort of like flowing shapes mixed with sharp angular surface. So there's like some hard surface bone or maybe even technology in there as well, and some drooping kind of wire or drapery shapes. And once I found a few that I like, I'm turning down the opacity and I'm kind of mixing and matching these alchemy silhouettes to kind of give myself a starting point. So I'm cutting and shearing off some of these pieces to try and make a figure. And once I feel like I have a silhouette that is a good starting point, I crank down the opacity and I just start drawing over it. And I'm using a brush that has some noise in it, so I'm stopping myself from getting too detailed focused because there's some unpredictability just in the way that I'm drawing. Because I'm looking for some happy accents. I'm looking for some discoveries along the way, and I don't want to just illustrate or add detail to this abstract shape. And see, I'm thinking about you turn it off for a while and draw and turn it back on, use it as reference. There's really no rules here other than not to be too precious with it. And now I'm using kind of a noisy, softer brush to kind of draw on top of it. I'm not, even worried about preserving the lines. I'm just using them as a launching point and seeing what happens. So I'm using some spattery type stuff, basically some brushes with some unpredictability, hoping that, there'll be some collision of ideas or shapes that inspire me to go in a certain direction. And a lot of those sort of wiggly brushes I used there earlier created these kind of interesting spike type shapes that kind of look like branches or something along those lines, or maybe wires. And I'm kind of building on that on the staff and a little around the head as well, and trying to bring it back in. And I think after I developed it for a little while, I wanted to go back and introduce some of those alchemy shapes back into it. I wanted some of those harder shapes. So I kind of turned some of that back on, and now I'm just basically focused on the silhouette. I'm using a lighter brush just to kind of outline the outside of it. And in that process, it occurred to me that one of those shapes kind of looked like another arm. So I thought it'd be interesting to explore the idea of an asymmetrical design where there are 2 arms holding up a staff. Maybe it's a super heavy staff. There's 2 arms holding up the staff and 1 on the other side. And so that's, that was just kind of a happy accident out of jamming some of those alchemy shapes together. I wasn't planning on it. You see on the left, I'm using a tool called Lazy Nizumi Pro, and it's a drawing tool that a lot of people use to kind of do perspective drawing in Photoshop, but it also can add noise and strange shapes to your brush strokes. So I use it for that. I use it to kind of distort my own drawings. I'm also using the lasso tool here, and I think using the lasso tool and filling is filling with a solid color is another great way to get a little unpredictability or variation in your shape language. It's not as easy to control as a brush in some ways, and you can't really be too detailed with it. So I like it to kind of offset some of my brush work to kind of blocking these shapes. I'm just adjusting the overall proportions now. Again, just selecting the entire thing and copying. I'm not worrying about preserving layers or working neat. I'm just making a mess. And that's really the fun part, is you want to make this design process as fluid and as natural as possible and hope for some of these accents. I'm trying to bring back some of those draped shapes that were in some of the other priest designs, and I'm using the lasso tool for that. Just kind of moving around the whole design. Sometimes, it's faster to kind of just duplicate and move things around than it is to draw them as well. So I'm even using the lasso tool to kind of like create hands as opposed to like drawing hands. Again, all with the goal of keeping myself from getting too detail oriented here. Just looking for some unusual shapes, moving the staff around. It's getting pretty close to the point where I feel like I could move to the next step with it. Like I like a lot of the things that are going on, and there's still ambiguity in the design. So I can explore it later. I'm drawing over it again with some line to try to add a little clarity to it. But again, using line and lasso tool, it's just to add clarity. It's not to add too much detail at this point. And you see I'm just duplicating parts of it and flipping it and painting them back in. I'm not looking for perfect shapes. I'm just looking for ideas at this point. Yeah, and in this last step here, I'm just kind of lightening the design and adding some line on top of it, again, to add just another layer of information that we can build on in our next step. I'm controlling myself, limiting myself from getting too detailed and turning this into a polished illustration. But I do find balance between line and form really useful in the design process. It lets me focus on different types of things. And at this point, I think we've got enough information that we can move on to the next step and see how we can take this rough sketch into 3D and see where it goes. So what I'm going to do now is take this design that we've created and go into 3D with it. And we're going to explore it using quick and sloppy 3D methods to see if we can take the design further. I wanted to show you these designs again. These were other designs that I had done previously that were in the same genre as the one we just did. And they're a little more refined. I spent a little more time on them. But I took those designs into 3D before and came up with these. So these are created in Blender. We're looking at Blender here. And I used some quick and dirty processes in Blender to get here. And if you look at these models, you can see that there's not a lot of detail. There's a lot of things just jammed into each other. There's some sloppy, weird mesh. But that's actually what we're after. We actually want to think about these like sketches and not be so concerned about creating a perfect model. Because really we're after design iteration and maybe some unpredictability. There's actually a lot of happy accidents in these models. The way this cloth kind of shears and tears and this sort of uneven texture on some of this tubing. A lot of that came out of the sort of artifacts of the process that we're going to use today. Now you can, of course, take this model a little further if you wanted to. So I have an example of how I did take that model and spend a little more time on it using ZBrush to kind of detail it out a bit more. This is still not a hyper detailed model and we're just looking at vertex colors. There's no UVs or textures on it, but you could of course spend more time on it, but our focus today is really more on generating ideas using Blender in this case as a tool for getting there. So here we are in Blender. I'm going to be using a lot of simple shapes to make our character. One of the first things I do is actually use a cylinder here, and I'm just using the cloth brush to kind of bang it around. The cloth brush kind of tries to simulate cloth interaction, but the reason I like using it a lot is it just adds a lot of unpredictability, some really natural organic shapes and unpredictability. And I'm working just on trying to get our large shapes done first. So, it has a robe and this is a big robe-like shape, but you can see I'm just like copying and smashing a copy of it into itself rather than try and get a perfect sculpt. I'm just doing a lot of duplication and moving around. I'm actually doing this entire character just using a mouse. I'm not using a tablet or anything else. And part of the reason is to keep myself from focusing too much on detail because I don't want to get into a sculpting mindset where I'm trying to get, really nice sculptural detail. At this point, I'm just designing the overall silhouette and shapes, starting with that 2D drawing, but leaving myself open to see where the design takes me. So there's going to definitely be some differences that develop out of this process. One of the techniques I'm using now is one of my favorite things to do, which is just jamming shapes together and using a Remesh filter on top of it. Now, a Remesh filter, or I should say modifier, the Remesh modifier, will take a group of shapes and then kind of voxel remesh them into a new continuous mesh. And I'm using it at pretty low settings, so you get this kind of, jagged edge. But it keeps things fast since I'm not worried about detail at this point. And you can see that I can go back into component mode and move those simple primitives around. And when I get out of that component mode, it gets remeshed again into a continuous surface. So it's a real fun way to kind of rough in all these shapes. You can see I'm just using cylinders for the main body. I'm using this sort of drawn and extruded shapes for the arms. It's really fast. It's much faster than spending the time to sculpt something nice. And you can get some pretty cool silhouettes and shapes really quickly. And there's also a little bit of unpredictability to it just because of the nature of remeshing. I'm using an add-on for Blender now called Ball Pen, which basically draws spheres on a surface. And you can see I'm doing that and then remeshing it for this staff, and I'm getting these kind of crazy shapes. And I'm doing what I do now in almost all my modeling, which is just making selections and using fall off on the move and rotate brushes to kind of bend and pull it into shape. I find that duplication and moving things into shape just with rotate and transforms is so much faster than sculpting. I'm using that ball pen tool again. You can see it just creates a whole bunch of spheres in a line. They look like little intestines. But if you remesh them, then they can kind of blend into the surface and give you some neat organic shapes. I'm using some cylinders now, and I'm going to use randomized transform, which just kind of randomly rotates and scales them within ranges you set to get a little unpredictability in those shapes. I'm just trying to shake something loose that I like for the base of the staff. And then once I have them all aligned like that, I'm just remeshing them again and again. So I'm trying to make some of those spikes, those sort of top tendril branch-like shapes that we had in our original design here, using that ball pen tool and remeshing them. And now that they're a continuous surface, I'm basically just using rotate with fall off to kind of pull them into a silhouette that I like. I think I'm thinking of something somewhere between a tree and and like I don't know, a piece of technology. Again, I'm going back and just adding some cylinders into those arm shapes, and they're going to be remeshed and become a continuous surface. But it just kind of creates a little variation in the experience. I need some shoulder pads now, but rather than taking the time to kind of draw out new shoulder pads, I'm just duplicating part of the arm. And again, pulling around those really simple primitives I have inside there with fall off. So they're kind of squishy. And the Remesh Filter modifier will kind of turn them into a continuous mesh. You can crank that remesh modifier up a lot if you really wanted a smooth surface, but I'm trying not to get bogged down in detail at this point. So I'm keeping it, low to medium poly and really fast to work with. I wasn't really sure what the back, we didn't really design the back in the 2D side of things. So I started moving these shoulder pads around the back. And I think that's going to lead to some pretty cool stuff later on. You see occasionally a light pop on. I'm just using light to kind of check my silhouettes and shapes, make sure that things are shadowing nicely. I'm using simple cubes to make the hands, and I'm using that ball pen add-on again, but this time with cubes instead of spheres. So instead of making little spheres, I'm making stretched out cubes, and I'm going to again remesh that. And you can see that it's there's no real detail here, but my goal is just to get the gesture of a hand-like shape. And once I get one of these, I can kind of just duplicate them around to the other hands. Obviously you could spend hours just sculpting a great hand. And it might be that you already have one in your library that you can use, but I didn't want to do any kit bashing for this demo. I wanted to show you that you can create it all as you're designing. But of course, there's nothing wrong with kit bashing. So if you have some existing models that you have, they can be a nice tool in your design as well. I just like to try and sculpt as much as possible to keep the design fresh. What I'm going to do here is just create some really simple hard surface detail, nothing too complicated, to kind of offset some of that really squishy organic detail. When we were designing this character, I was thinking that it was a priest-like character, but somewhere between organic and mechanical, that maybe it's got some, robot arms, or it's got a few mechanical parts mixed in with those organic flowing shapes of the robe. Another simple technique you can use to rough shapes out is just to use spheres with fall off on basic transform commands. So I just created a sphere and pulled it apart to kind of create this sort of pouch-like shape on the front of the character. And now I'm going back to the back, and as I'm putting those shoulder pads down, I remesh them together to create this cool spine-like shape, and it inspires me just to kind of make a bigger spine. So I start adding all these bone plates to the back. And this wasn't planned. It just occurred to me as I was merging those things together, and I think it's a pretty interesting part of the design. This stuff can get really squishy, and so I'm just kind of scaling it down to make sure it actually looks a little bit more like cloth on a surface. I'm using that ball pen tool again to just draw out these quick sort of spike tendril-like shapes. So the original design had these sort of shapes coming off the head, and it really wasn't clear in the design whether they're organic or mechanical. So at this point, I'm keeping them kind of ambiguous. You know, we could develop it further later on to go either direction. But I'm just trying to play with the surface and break it up. You can see that I'm trying to fight the temptation here to get too much into sculpting. But because I'm using a mouse and the ball pen, I don't really have all the tools that let me get detailed. So I kind of just give up and move on to something else, which is good, right? I'm trying to keep myself from those habits and slowing down. Again, this is the remesh modifier we're looking at. I'm just going back into the components, those simple shapes, either those spheres or cylinders that make up a lot of this character, and moving around and letting remesh turn him into a continuous form. There's my spines again, and you can see how as you pull it around, that remesh filter will just kind of regenerate the mesh. It's a really powerful conceptual tool. Using the ball pen just to get a little more, I guess I was trying to echo some of those staff shapes in the back, just get some more of those drooping things. What I'm doing here is using one of my favorite tools in Blender called Grease Pencil. And Grease Pencil can be used for a lot of things, but it's basically a drawing tool that draws these lines that you can make thick enough to look like wires and cables, or you could use them almost like cross-hatching ink style on top of a model. I'm going to use them here like wires, and they're really fun, and you can just draw them out really quickly. You're not really worrying about any sort of topology. You can vary the thickness, you can do the color. I'm using them really simply here, and I'm going to convert them to mesh, but you could leave them as a grease pencil object if you're just going to kind of render out of Blender. But you can convert these to more standard mesh, which I'm going to do here in a minute, because that lets me manipulate them further. So what you do is you take a grease pencil object and you can convert it to a Bezier curve, and inside Blender, your Bezier curves can have different types of mesh, right? You can extrude them or offset them. And that's what I was playing with there, was kind of how thick to make them. And I'm tapering the ends now using some of the thick thin tool. I'm trying not to spend too much time, and I'm probably spending a little more time obsessing on these than I should, but they were pretty quick to make. And what I'm going to do once I'm done kind of adjusting the curves and the density is I'm going to convert them to standard polygonal mesh. And at that point, they're just like anything else. And I'm just using the simple fall off transform tools to kind of sculpt them into place. I decided I like them enough that I want to add a few more into the staff. But what I'm going to do here is, instead of keeping them as a separate wire, they're going to actually be added into the core geometry and get remeshed and just become part of the staff. So when I'm converting them, I'm playing with different ways of converting the mesh, and I noticed I'm starting to get some noise in there, and I really like this noise, and so I decided to kind of keep it and exaggerate it. And so when I remesh that these into it, some of that noise stays around and gives me some more unplanned texture in the staff. That reminds me a little bit of those sort of spiky shapes that I originally drew that almost look like hairs or something. And now I'm just trying to get a better gesture out of this. Since a lot of this is about shape design and gesture and overall shape, I'm spending time to try and make that look good. I want to do some more cloth on this character. He had these drooping cloth parts in the original design. And rather than spend time doing a really nice model, all I'm doing is throwing some planes in and using the cloth brush to just kind of yank it down and make it look like hanging cloth. And I won't spend too much time in the cloth brush, but just a little bit of time can give you a cloth-like appearance, and then you can delete and duplicate and use your standard transform tools to kind of pull it into shape. I'm really more interested in the silhouette and the gesture of the cloth than, the exact wrinkle and surface detail. Because I think this character's design appeal in part is the sort of playing the drooping cloth shapes off the sort of more hard surface things like the back plates and the staff and the shoulder pads. And I'm rotating around quite a bit just to, I like to make sure one of the power of 3D design versus 2D drawing is that you can consider it from a lot of different angles. So at the very least, I always look at the design from the front and side to make sure that I'm not accidentally working in a 2D plane, so it actually feels like a solid design at the end of the day. Again, we didn't design the back in 2D, so now I'm playing with the idea of putting some more sort of cloth shapes on the back. I decided to do a cloth sim here, where I actually define the shoulders as collision volumes and run a cloth simulation to see if I can get a kind of cool cowl or cape up here. And I play with it for a little while, but I don't like that it hides so much of the design, all those cool shoulder pad angles and such. So I get kind of experimental and just start using the cloth brush at really high settings. Just kind of twirl it around to see if, I don't know, it inspires something, because I'm not going to keep it as it is right now. So I just wanted to see if maybe I'd get kind of an inspiration or a happy accident. And I do actually wind up getting something that I use in unusual ways that I wasn't planning on. So you can see here, I'm just really crunching it. And as I twirled around, I'm like, oh, that looks kind of like a back cape. And I really like the gesture of it, the way it's kind of flying off the character. So I kind of rotate it around and it becomes this sort of like half cape that's coming off his non-staff arm side. I go back to the robe and I'm using procedural noise and displace filter just to see if I can get, I don't know, a little slightly more interesting shape really quickly out of the robe. And I keep that as well. So now when I'm trying to remesh this cape, and I notice I get some artifacts if I use the remesh at a really weird setting. And I like those artifacts. They kind of remind me of dust or action lines. So I keep it as a separate object. And then it occurs to me that it kind of looks like magic or energy too. And so I duplicate it and just put a simple glow material on it. And, I wasn't planning on this at all. This is one of those happy accidents. And I really like the way it added something to the design. The nice part about duplicating things like that is not only is it fast, it actually creates some unity in your design between like the cape shapes and the way the magic flows. And so that was pretty cool. I'm working on the hood here. I think overall the hood is probably the least successful part of this design. But so I'm fighting the urge to get in here and sculpt too much. So I do a little bit, but I pull myself out of that habit. But it's again using that cloth brush just to add some noise and some unpredictability to the shapes. And I'm just kind of smoothing and sharpening it a little bit just to see if something inspiring comes out of it. And I kind of feel like I lost a little bit of the silhouette. So I'm just quickly going back in with using Dino Topo and Snake Hook, which is just a way to say I'm yanking out these tendrils out of the mesh without worrying about the topology too much. And I think the design is more or less working at this point for the purposes of the sketch. So I'm just trying to close it out by adding some simple materials. And this is where I wound up. So you can see it from all angles. And this design deviated from our 2D concept a bit, but still used a lot of it and explored a few new things with some happy accidents. Now for some hot tips. Well, first, I think it's important to remember that you should invite accidents into your conceptual art process. The goal of concept art is to find new ideas and to solve problems. And if your process is too controlled, is too strict, you might be passing up on some opportunities. And the great thing about digital art creation is that accidents can happen all the time with tools, and you can just undo them if you don't like them. But instead of just getting rid of accidents, look for them and see if there's some fruit to bear in those accidents, something new that you can make from something that you hadn't planned. Second, don't be afraid to make a mess. I know that when you're working in a production pipeline, you have to be very careful about making sure your work is clean and performant and all of that. But when you're coming up with new ideas and exploring concepts, feel free to make a mess. And I think that's especially important in 3D. I think 3D, because it's often seen as a more technical tool, it's a little harder to make a mess, but let yourself make a mess. Copy things, jam them together, distort them, see what happens. And lastly, I think it's important to remember that at the end of the day, concept art is about exploration, not perfection. It's not about creating a perfect illustration. It's about finding the idea that really works for the game or the project that you're working on. Of course, creating polished illustrations and mood paintings has its place, but that can come later. I think initially you really want to go after those new ideas and adopt a process that allows for that. And I want to put up some resources here that show some of the tools that I used during this. And first is Alchemy. And Alchemy is that drawing program that I showed initially that lets you kind of create abstract shapes, and it is free. So you can go and download that and give it a shot and see if it works for you. Lazy Nezumi is a plugin for Photoshop, and it's a really great tool, and you can use it for a lot of things, from drawing really crisp ink lines to perspective assist, but I like it because it also has a lot of tools for introducing random distortion and unusual things to your brushstrokes. Blender is the 3D program that I was using, and Blender is an amazing program that's getting updated all the time. It's completely free, runs on a lot of different platforms, and is really great. So I'd recommend learning it, especially early in your career, because it's a great tool to have. And both Ball Pen and Quick Shape are add-ons for Blender. These are inexpensive add-ons, and I like them because they are really kind of designed for conceptual modeling. They're a little bit more like drawing, and they sort of invite creating a mess as you're just looking for shapes and ideas, and kind of keep you away from spending too much time sculpting. Well, thank you, everyone, and I'll be around to answer some questions during Konsoll as well.